Mr. Chomsky,
Okay.
thank you for having us here. And well, the first question I have to ask you is, how did you get in touch with DMST? When was your first contact with them?
Well, actually, my first direct contact was about 20 years ago. I was visiting Brazil and don't exactly remember how it was arranged, but I was able to take part in a kind of some sort of regional meeting that they were having of representatives of various communities, and of course they were talking in Portuguese, but somebody was translating for me, and I was listening to their discussions, conversations. I was quite interested. I was particularly interested in their hesitant and somewhat ambiguous relationship to the PT. They were sort of sympathetic, but they didn't really want to be closely involved. They wanted to be separated. This was before Lula had been elected, but they thought it was an interesting organization, but not them. They were keeping their independence, and it was quite interesting to listen to the discussions of. Didn't have anything like the detail of what you were describing, but I could get a sense of what it was like. And I've tried since to, just by reading, to follow some of the things they're doing. There's not a great deal of information around.
And it was funny because before getting to know the MST on my trips, you were one of the people who I read, and I said, wait a minute, there's something wrong here, because what I watch on TV, what I read on the papers, what I listen in the radio is something completely different from what these guys are saying. How can you hide a movement of more than 1 million people from a country where this movement is happening? And people from outside this country get to know this movement much better than the people inside the country.
It's what's known as hegemonic ideology, Gramsci's point. It's very hard to escape. And part of personal and social liberation is to break through those bonds. It shows everywhere. I mean, why do, in the United States, let's say, there's a kind of a mantra that everyone repeats. We've got a terrible problem. China is killing us. Mexico is killing us. They're stealing our jobs. It's repeated over and over. It takes the intelligence of a 7-year-old to understand that China, that when Apple computers just a couple of weeks ago decided to transfer their last production unit to China, it was not because the CEO, Tom Cook, had a gun to his head held by Xi saying, you got to transfer your plant to China. So it's plainly not China that's killing us. It's the people who are making the decisions about Apple Computer, GE, Boeing, IBM. They're the ones who are killing us. Well, who are they? Well, they're a bunch of bankers and others who sit in boardrooms in Chicago and New York. So then the next question is, well, why should they be making the decisions? What right do they have to make to kill us, to destroy our communities and our jobs? Next step, maybe you have to be 9 years old to figure this out, is let's take it over ourselves and kick them out and make the decisions ourselves. We are the ones who run the plant. We work there. We're the communities, the people who provide the basis for it. So fine, we'll make the decisions. Then China won't be killing us. The board of directors and the bankers in New York and Chicago won't be. We'll decide what we ought to do. Very, very simple series of steps, perfectly obvious. Any child can understand it. Does anybody say it?
Yeah.
That's called hegemonic ideology. It was kind of Orwell had a nice comment about it. something that most people haven't read. Everybody's read Animal Farm, satire on the totalitarian enemy. But he actually had an introduction to Animal Farm, which wasn't published. It was discovered many years later in his papers, suppressed. But in the introduction, he's talking to the people of England, and he says, of course, this book is satire about the totalitarian Russian enemy, but the people of England shouldn't be too self-righteous about it, because in free England, I'm now quoting, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And he doesn't give some examples, doesn't say much about it, but one of the reasons, he says, is simply if you have a good education. You've gone to all the right schools, you graduated from Oxford and Cambridge, you studied all the right things, you just have internalized the understanding without thinking about it, that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. Like, for example, that it's the bankers in New York who are killing us, not China. Just wouldn't do to say that. You can't even think it. When you get to the point where you can't even think things, that's real subordination to ideology. And that's quite typical of free democratic countries, and I think what you're describing in Brazil is quite similar. It's just the kind of thing you don't say and you don't think. It doesn't take much intelligence to figure it out.
I watched the video maybe 20 years ago or something like that, when you visit MST, and you were saying on the video that it was the largest social movement in the world.
That's the impression I got, yeah.
So what's the importance of MST as a case study for the world?
I think, I probably get a dozen letters every day from young people saying, how can we possibly break out of this system of oppression? What other possible way of living is there? They need models. They have to say, look, there are things that people can do and they work. I give them many examples, but this would be a perfect example. It says, yes, there are forms of life outside of the state capitalist repressive systems that we live in. We don't have to accept this form of domination. We don't have to, take something else that people don't think. Just an ordinary wage worker, person who works in some enterprise. Most of your waking life, you're living in a system that is far more totalitarian than any totalitarian state that ever existed. In Stalinist Russia, for example, nobody told you you're not allowed to go to the bathroom. You have to wait 3 hours. Or you can't talk to that person next to you. Or you have to keep doing the same thing 28 hours a day. This is the kind of clothes you have to wear. Nobody ever dreams of, nothing like that happens in the most extreme totalitarian state, but it happens in almost every wage earner's life, most of their lives. Do you have to live like that? Is that the only form of existence where some totalitarian ruler is totally controlling just about every action you do, every motion you make, every thought you have, and so on, for most of your waking life? Obviously not. There are alternatives. Let's see one. Well, okay, here's one that's alive and well. That's the kind of thing that breaks through the bonds and tells people the things you've always been indoctrinated in and told have to be true are not. It's not like the air you breathe. It's just a particular form of domination and authority that you can break out of. Just like slaves had to come to understand, you don't have to be a slave. Women had to understand, no, you don't have to be subordinated. These are hard things to break through, very hard.
And
make it personal. My grandmother, for example, didn't think that she was being oppressed. My mother already sort of understood and didn't like it. My daughters would never tolerate it for a minute. But that has to that understanding has to be achieved, and it's not easy.
There's something there's really interesting that in countries like in Brazil, where you have a lot of concentration of wealth, the people who owns the wealth, they are in one side really strong because they have all the wealth, and the other people depend on them to work for them to like make their living. But at the same time, they have like they have run away from the productive world a long time ago. So they have no idea if a lettuce is born from the land or from the shelf in the supermarket. They don't know how to like make a share. They don't know how to put like a brick over another brick. So they're 100% dependent on the rest of the people who know how to build wealth. So they're strong and fragile at the same time. So their strategy is to build like a big wall so that these people cannot cross that wall and start to own.
They cannot think that they can cross it. I think that's the crucial part. As long as they can't think, I can cross that wall, then the structure of repression is safe. As soon as you can think, yeah, I can cross that wall. I don't have to listen to that guy tell me how to fix this because I know how to do it and he doesn't. I'll make the decisions. He can join me if he wants and be another worker. When you make that step, you can say, yes, that wall is not, it's not unbreakable. I can get through it, in fact, easily. Then you can change things.
And MST, in a kind of way, makes people cross that wall, because when they get access to the land, I mean, they are independent. They can build their wealth. So they cannot go to a farm and say, please let me work for you and build wealth for you. Do you think this is one of the reasons why there's such a campaign against them? Because they are an example that crossing that wall not only is possible, but it's revolutionary. It can change our society.
Not only that, but the more thoughtful of them are quite aware of it. Let me give you one of many examples. When John F. Kennedy came into office in the United States, he was concerned with shifting relations to Latin America. So he set up a Latin American study group of smart guys who would give him advice on what to do about Latin America. And their summary report was written by Arthur Schlesinger, a well-known historian, liberal historian, Kennedy advisor. And the report, which it's been made public since, was classified. It's quite interesting. So, for example, with regard to Cuba, remember, this is 1961-60, said Cuba's dangerous because of the possible thread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, something which might have great appeal to many poor people in Latin America who are suffering from the same kind of repression and violence as the poor people in Cuba. So that idea of taking matters into your own hands, that's the threat of Castro. Exactly what you're talking about. Don't want to let that spread.
And on MST, they have a relationship with the soil, with the land, that it's, for me, the impression that I had is that changes also the social relations. We come from like human beings. Human comes from humus. Humus comes from soil, right? So I got the impression that they're much more human than we are on the cities, on the large cities, in terms of solidarity, in terms of looking for each other, in terms of understanding that the group is as strong as the weakest portion of the group. Do you think that we're in the 21st century, we're talking about like apps and virtual reality and all those things? What do you think is the role of the land, not only the land, but the land reform and that groups as MST to rescue humanity for us?
I think it's a way of providing a model, but to be significant, we have to recognize some clear demographic facts. Most of the population of the world is becoming urban, and there have to be urban collectives of a comparable kind, which will have these structures of solidarity, mutual aid, self-government, and so on. I think that can be done. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied specifically to land, although in fact an integration of land and city can be developed and constructed, urban gardens, so on and so forth, which can make a more rich and complex life in which people are not restricted to a specific form of occupation and lifestyle, but can share and enjoy a variety of them. It's kind of Karl Marx said almost nothing about future societies, but one of the few things he said is we can imagine a day when a person can farm in the morning and hunt in the afternoon and build something in the evening and so on and so forth. It's a rich, full human being should be able to participate in many aspects of life at one level or another. Having an urban garden is not the same thing as working several acres of planting field, but it's a small part of sharing in the possible richness and variety of human life.
And what do you think is the importance for countries territorially large as Brazil and poor as Brazil in terms of a large portion of the population being so poor, of a land reform? Do you think it's important to have a land reform?
It's critical, not only a land reform, but preservation of large areas from development and destruction. The Amazon, for example, is it's been called the lungs of the earth. The Amazon is critical for the survival of humans everywhere. Conservation and preservation of land, which has been it's been in the lead of understanding the importance of that, actually, are the indigenous populations throughout the world, not just in Brazil, who want to live in harmony with the land, not to destroy it. That has to be a component of land reform of the kind that would lead to egalitarian collectives instead of monstrous capitalist agribusiness, which is destructive and structurally and intolerable for the reasons we've been discussing. So land reform is one of many initiatives that have to be taken in radically inegalitarian countries like Brazil to break the extraordinary spectacle of extreme wealth right alongside of hideous poverty. That shouldn't be tolerable to people.
The government is arming the farmers officially, and the government is trying to pass a bill that criminalizes officially the MST. Is it like a world phenomenon, or is it like just Brazil, and what can be done to fight against it?
Well, it's not something new. It goes back to the enclosures in England, which dispossessed people from the commons. It's been happening for centuries. Brazil under Bolsonaro is an extreme version of it, but the dispossession of people from their land and their rights and their mode of livelihood has been, and that turning them into serfs subject to authority, that's been going on for a long time. Bolsonaro wants to do it by force and violence, and it should be bitterly resisted.
And it's interesting because people from the cities in Brazil, they look at the slums and say, oh, that's an absurd. These guys are thieves, these guys are robbers, I don't want them here. And then they look at MST and say, I don't want that too. But the problem is that if you remove the guys from MST, they have nowhere to go. So they have to go to the cities and live on the slums. Why it is so hard for the middle class to understand something that, as you say, a kid of like 7-year-old should understand, that if the guys are not in the land, they have to be somewhere.
Well, it's often been observed that if it's to your benefit not to understand something, it's very easy not to understand it. We're all aware of that. And as a class issue, it's almost a definition of the class. Like, take these slums. The problem isn't just that others might come into the slums. Why should they exist? Why should they exist in the first place? And are they really dens of criminals, more so than the banks where you were working? Well, depends how you look at it. What's called white-collar crime is vastly more dangerous and much more prevalent than somebody robbing a store.
I mean,
and not just white-collar crime, legal activities of the professions, which ought to be criminal, morally are criminal, even if legal. They put in the shadows the petty crime that the middle class is afraid of.
About the system of MST, in terms of the way they're organized, they look a lot, at least that was my impression, and I want to hear from you, from what you say in your books, that what we should have as a goal in terms of society. Is it correct, my impression, or?
Well, I don't want to pretend to be an expert in it. I haven't really investigated the MIT collectives, closely to see how they work. But my general impression is that what you said is not implausible. It seems to have the kind of structures and goals that should be we should aspire to for a decent existence.
Where we'll see, that's my last question. I mean, we're living some tough times, and sometimes I try to be optimistic and see the world as a pendulum, because the same way we had Obama, black president in the States, and a lot of people looked at it and said, hey, we initiated a new phase, and then suddenly after him, we have Donald Trump. We had like Papa Ratzinger, and then after Papa Ratzinger, we have Papa Francisco. So sometimes the world seems to be a pendulum. How do you see the world which is flirting with the extreme right, or like hugging and adopting the extreme right in many important countries in the world? How do you see this world 10, 20 years from now? More to the extreme right, or with the pendulum coming back?
Well, first of all, if you look over history, I think you can see a kind of periods of progress, periods of regression, but the general tendency is positive. So say, take the United States, for example. In many respects, by comparative standards, a free democratic society. Go back to the 1960s, okay? Take a look at the United States in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the United States had anti-miscegenation laws so extreme that when the Nazis were looking for models for the Nuremberg laws, the only model they could see was the United States, but the U.S. laws were too extreme for them, because the U.S. laws said 1 drop of blood, that was the phrase, makes you black. So if you had a great-great-great-grandmother who was black, you're black. That was too much for the Nazis. That was up until the 1960s. Up until the 1960s, the federal government laws on housing required segregation. These were passed under the New Deal liberal administrations. They didn't like them, but the only way they could get them any housing passed at all, given the prevalent racism was to build these laws into it. That was into the 1960s. Until 1975, women in the United States still were not recognized as legally peers. They didn't have a guaranteed right to serve in a federal trial. Legally, they were basically property, as was the case in the founding, when the country was founded, took over British law. A woman's the property of her father, handed over to her husband. It gradually eroded, but literally it was not until 1975 that legal equality was established. There were anti-sodomy laws in the United States into this millennium. We can go on and on. I mean, if we think what things were like not very far back, there's been quite a lot of improvement. And there are many things now which are just unchallengeable. Things that were inconceivable 50 years ago are now virtually unchallengeable. It didn't come as a gift from God, It came as the result of lots of popular organization and struggle. Now, if you look through history, yeah, that's been true for a long time. Now, can you carry this trajectory forward? That's not so clear. The reason is, for the first time in human history, questions are arising about the possibility of survival of organized human society, and not in the distant future. Actually, there are at least two major ones, and they're not the only ones. One is the threat of nuclear war, which is in fact increasing. We've been living under that shadow for 75 years, and it's kind of a miracle that we've survived, and miracles don't continue. The other is the extreme danger of environmental catastrophe, which just can't be laughed about. And we have this unbelievable spectacle, something that is almost unimaginable. If anybody's watching us from outer space, they'd think we're insane. The most powerful country in human history, the wealthiest country with incomparable advantages, is not only refusing to take part in doing anything about it, but is insisting on devoting its resources to accelerating the race to disaster. And nobody's talking about it. That's the amazing thing. Take a look at the debates over the debates in the election, or take a look at polls in which people are asked what problem was most important for you. Do you even see a mention of the fact that the worst criminal acts in human history are being carried out right before your eyes? I mean, Hitler didn't want to destroy organized human society, but that's happening right before our eyes. Nobody sees it. Nobody looks at it. It's kind of like what you were saying about not seeing MST, but exaggerated to a cosmic level. Well, so you cannot simply carry the past trajectory forward, because there are new issues arising of real existential threats that have to be overcome. There has to be a breakthrough in understanding that it's not only individual bad decisions, it's institutional structures that are concrete. Let's take something else that a 7-year-old can understand. Take the biggest banks, say J.P. Morgan Chase. Jamie Dimon, the CEO, knows as much about the environmental crisis as you and I do. But he is pouring money into development of fossil fuels, and the most dangerous of them, like Canadian tar sands, with perfect knowledge that this means he's making a major contribution to the destruction of organized human life on Earth in the not very distant future. Well, just put yourself in his chair and ask, how can a person do that? Well, there's a kind of a reason. He has two choices. He can either decide to do this, or he can be kicked out, and somebody else will do it. Okay, this is an institutional problem. It's not just an individual problem. And that has to be understood. These institutions are lethal to human existence. They've always been problematic and harmful. Now they're lethal. And those are very serious problems that can't be pushed aside.
If possible, I have one more question. As now I'm talking to a lot of the people on the Congress and the Senate, they call me, they send me message, Eduardo, what now? I mean, this guy has no limits. He's destroying Brazil on a pace that has never happened before. Can I sit beside you and you record a quick message to the politicians in Brazil of the progressive wing?
Well, I think in Brazil there are very concrete steps that can be taken. For one thing, if we look back at say my last visit to Brazil, which was last September, right before the election, something quite striking happened. The person who was in a position to win the election, according to every poll, was suddenly put in prison, in solitary confinement, banned from making a public statement right before the crucial election. There were charges, but didn't take a genius to figure out that even if you believed the charges, which were pretty dubious, they had absolutely no relation to the severity of the sentence. So there was plainly an effort, and we can trace it back to Dilma's impeachment and on, kind of a elite coup underway to ensure that the voice of the people will not be heard, and that we will somehow be able to ram through someone who will do exactly what you're describing, destroying Brazil, turning it into Brazil, which 10 years ago was maybe the most respected country in the world, is now a laughingstock. Take a look at what happened at G20. Brazil's being sold. The conception, Guedes' principle, privatize everything, says sell Brazil to foreign investors, give away everything, destroy the Amazon, crush indigenous people, put arms into the hands of farmers so they'll kill collectors. All of this is happening as part of a coup that's been taking place very dramatically. Now we're learning more about it. Glenn Greenwald's revelations in Intercept are making it quite clear that this was an extraordinarily corrupt operation planned by someone who was posed and was put forth as the great hero, but is mired in corruption to try to create exactly the situation that Brazil is now facing. Well, that makes it possible to take steps to reverse it. It's not an act of God. It's not immutable. It's in the hands of the people of Brazil to reverse this.